Hello, and thank you for joining EarthEcho's STEMExplore Virtual Career Connection, featuring Dr. Julie Vecchio, a fisheries biologist at the University of South Florida. My name is Olivia Blondheim, and I'm a PhD student at the University of South Florida, where I study marine biology, and I'm also a member of EarthEcho International's Youth Leadership Council and Board of Directors. EarthEcho International is a nonprofit founded on the belief that youth have the power to change the planet. Our free programs and resources have reached more than 2 million people in 146 countries. This live event is part of STEMexplore, EarthEcho's program that brings inspiration to life by telling the stories of dynamic female professionals in STEM careers during live virtual career connections. And we, of course, want to thank our sponsor, Raytheon Technologies, for their support of women in STEM. Now, just a reminder that you can send in questions anytime for our expert, and we will answer those throughout today's event. If you're joining in Zoom, please use the Q&A feature, and if you're on YouTube, please use the comment section to ask your questions to our expert. Now, let's get started by introducing our STEMexplore mentor, Dr. Julie Vecchio. Julie, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. I am really excited to be here. My name is Julie Vecchio, and I approximately 6 months ago finished my PhD in marine science at the University of South Florida. I am currently working for the state of Florida in the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, where my job essentially includes using the data that we collect about fishers, about the people that are fishing throughout the state of Florida. I am also a host of a podcast called the Fisheries Podcast and a member of a group called the Women of Fisheries. So just really have my toes in a wide variety of different areas of fisheries. And I'm excited to talk to you more about it.
Absolutely. We're so glad to have you. And of course, congratulations on finishing your PhD. I, of course, know what a huge accomplishment that is and what a journey that is. So I can't wait to hear more about your experience throughout today's session.
Yeah.
So first of all, I do want to ask you and start off, we have a series of questions for you. And as we have our conversation, I'll be sure, of course, to ask questions coming in from our live audience. But first off, let's start with, what do you do for a living?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So my current job, as I said, is for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, and I work in with the Fishery Dependent Monitoring Group. So in general, a marine fisheries biologist is a person who is studying the ocean fish populations, the harvest of fish in the ocean, and providing data for what we call stock assessments. And so those are when we take all this data, put it all together, and figure out how many of these fish there are and how many we can sustainably harvest without harming the population too much. And, oh, sorry, I didn't know where we were in the presentation.
Nope, you're totally good. And again, this is just open conversation. So the as we go, we'll just bring up different things as well. So
okay, yeah. So I also mentioned that I am currently also a volunteer host of a podcast that's called the Fisheries Podcast. And we our goal really is to spread the knowledge about the world of fisheries and what all is involved in fisheries, and just tell the stories of a wide variety of different fisheries scientists. We have almost 100 episodes out now, and we really just want to show everybody and showcase what a fisheries biologist looks like, what their journeys are like, and what their backgrounds are, and what types of things they study, what they do.
That's amazing. And I know here at EarthEcho, we love Fishery. EarthEcho recently connected them with a virtual field trip, and we have partnered with them to share their resources. So if anybody's watching is interested, you can visit earthecho.org to learn more about fishery and how to get involved. So of course, I think that's amazing that you're involved in fisheries. Of course, as a marine biologist, I appreciate that. But I also know that you mentioned in the beginning, you have a lot of different roles and how every day looks a little bit different. So I'd love to hear, just on average, what does an average day look like for you?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Well, these days, especially with COVID and my current job and everything like that, it is, to be honest, my job is a lot of computer work. So overall, what we do is the program that I work for, again, I've mentioned it a few times, it's called Fisheries Dependent Monitoring. Essentially, what we are trying to do is capture the fisheries in Florida, the marine fisheries, primarily the ocean fisheries. And what that means is finding out when people are going fishing, how long they're going fishing, what they're catching, and and then trying to extrapolate that to the entire population. Because of course, when we're sampling for, when we're going out to boat ramps and asking people questions, we can't interview every single person. There's millions of them. And so we interview a few and extrapolate that out into the wider population. So that's our overall goal. My particular job right now is taking all of that data, using a lot of different statistics and statistical softwares to create information that people need in order to make good decisions about our fisheries management. So I might be providing a map of where people are catching fish, or I might be providing a graph that tells, the sizes of different fish that people are catching or something like that. And a lot of it really does just have to do with what people are asking, what types of information are necessary at that moment. Right now, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, which is the entity that does the Fishery project, they are working on a stock assessment for red snapper. So I've spent the last couple of months providing information about red snapper from our data, and several other people in our group have as well. So we're just trying to get together all of the information that people might need to make the most appropriate decisions about how many fish there are, how many we can catch, and how to keep those populations sustainable.
Absolutely. And I think it's so cool that a lot of your work, I recognize very well some of that coding. And so it looks very complicated. And there's some days where you're out in the field doing really cool stuff. And then there's other days where you're sitting on a computer, for days at a time trying to get your code to run. But for our viewers who may never have actually done any of that coding, how did you learn those skills, and how do they really play into your work?
Well, that's a really good question. There are several different programs these days that people do what we call command line statistics. So most computer programs that a lot of people are familiar with, Word, etc., those are all what we call menu driven, and there's lots of different, you just click on something and something happens. In this command line, which is the stuff that I have over on the left, you have to actually write down every single little tiny thing to make something happen. And I guess I was first exposed to this kind of statistical programming when I did my master's degree back in 2003 or 2004. And that was really my very first introduction, and I hated it. It was like the worst thing I'd ever done in my whole entire life, because I'd always done like Word and stuff, and now I use basically two different programs almost interchangeably. And I really hate to go back and forth between them. What's on the screen right now is a program that's called R, which is a free software, which has an amazing community. The people that contribute packages and new ways of analyzing to the R universe are just incredible. They show you everything, how to do it. They're constantly answering questions. It's a really, really fabulous community. if you need to use a command line statistical software, I definitely endorse R from both a monetary and just a sweet community kind of standpoint.
For sure. Yeah, I definitely spent a lot of time in art. And I think that's one of the beauties of being a biologist, or in your case, a fisheries biologist, is that so often we think that all of our job is us being out on a boat. And for some people, that's great. I like being on a boat. But for people who maybe want to do more of the coding, there's so much need for people to write these packages and make it so that it's really easy for people like us to go and then analyze our data. So I definitely, if you're not interested in potentially being out at sea, but you really like marine life, this is a really also a great way to fit into this community and help contribute. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because not everybody gets to see the end of, we get to have all the fun pictures of being at sea, but we don't always have the photos of all the maps and everything behind.
I mean, I'm definitely a field girl as well. I love it. I love being out on the ocean and being, the Gulf of Mexico is my second home. But, the reality of these days and, just the type of job that I do right now, it's a lot more sitting in front of a computer screen. And it can be fun too. I actually just did an interview for the podcast with a friend of mine whose entire dissertation was modeling. She modeled a whole bunch of different things all together. And I said, what was your favorite thing? And she was like, just figuring out every problem was just like, she's like, I had so many dance parties in my office, and I can identify with that. And we did, I would get excited when I figure something out and make it actually work.
Absolutely. Especially when you're sitting there trying to code for days on end, and then suddenly your script works and you get the very beautiful figure that you've been trying to make all this time. It is very rewarding. So it does have a very good reward at the end. But we actually do have a question in our Zoom chat from Cassandra. And she said, do all fields of marine biology require coding?
Well, that's a really good question. It depends completely honestly on exactly what you want to be studying and what, I don't want to say level, but sort of like how far you want to go in your education. Like I said, the work that I do relies very heavily on people that are out in the field and interacting with fishers. And there's also another whole subset of fisheries data collection where those people are out fishing. I used to do a lot of that. We would take traps out, we would do hook and line, we would, nets, and even video cameras. I spent quite a bit of time learning how to identify fish on a video camera. And so, those are all incredibly important skills and incredibly important jobs. We need all of that information, and we need somebody to go and get that information before we can do any of the coding. So I wouldn't let it really intimidate you out of the field. I think that coding, again, is sort of a skill that you work yourself into frequently and sometimes unfortunately, but
Yeah, and I think the big thing about coding is that it's a tool, right? Just like everything, like you mentioned, there's so many different tools that we kind of have in our toolkit as biologists and marine biologists. And so that's a really big thing, is that when I started graduate school, I had very limited coding experience, but they do offer courses in it that are really helpful and give you problems to kind of work through and build up those sets. And then also, like Julie mentioned, there's such a great community online. So there's so many different ways to learn it. So definitely don't let that discourage you from going into this field, because it's all just kind of things that you pick up as you go. But as we kind of mentioned, that's kind of the other side of things, but more of the fun side. What is one of the coolest things you've done or seen as part of your job?
Oh man, yeah. So I have been basically working with the ocean for approximately 20 years now. So I've done a lot of different types of jobs, and I think we'll get into some of that later. But I think a couple of different things stand out for me. Probably the very top of my list is working and sampling in the Dry Tortugas National Park. If people aren't familiar with the Dry Tortugas, it is a national park which is something like 90% underwater. There's very little land actually in the park. Most of it is just coral reefs, which are situated about 60 miles to the west of Key West. So if you go all the way to the end of the Keys and you look out from there, towards Texas, you'll sort of be able to imagine seeing the park. And it's just so amazing. It's so remote. It's probably one of the last places in the US that's left essentially untouched. There's very little in the way of human activity and fishing and anything else. And it's just an incredibly beautiful place. And I'm so lucky to have gotten to sample there like 3 different times. It's a really, really special spot. And probably a close second, now that I've, been living and working in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico for close to 15 years, is doing routine sampling in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf is absolutely a unique body of water. There's really no place I've ever been similar. And I've sailed the Atlantic, I've sailed the Pacific. The Gulf is just its own thing. And it's amazing. And it's just really, really neat. It's an incredible mishmash of different habitats and different, the species that are there are just this like crazy array of northern species and southern species. And in this picture that's here, the sampling picture is on the right, you can see what we call a chevron trap. And the right side of the sampling picture is a trap. And that was to collect different species of fish. And then on the one that we're working is a large camera pod. So there are actually 4 different cameras facing in 4 different directions, which get lowered down to the bottom, left there for about a half an hour, and just record on their own all of the different fish and invertebrate species that come by. And then afterwards, we would watch those videos to code all of the different types of species. The picture on the right is probably one of my very favorite species in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, and that is called a Goliath grouper. If you've never gotten the chance to see a Goliath grouper in person or go scuba diving with one, it is one of the most incredible things. They can be up to like 8 feet long. They're massively wide around, and they're kind of grumpy. They're not like aggressive grumpy, but they're like just kind of grumpy, like, and they like to hang around wrecks in, the kind of areas where you might want to go scuba diving, like 50, 60, 70 feet. They hang around the wrecks, and then you can literally like come within a couple of feet of them, and then they'll usually like just grump and just like swim away. But they're just incredible animals to be able to see in our area too.
I love that. Yeah. And I think the Gulf of Mexico, I've only been here for a few years now as I've been working on my PhD, but the more and more I find out about the Gulf of Mexico and I get to experience it, the more amazing I find it. So I love that there's so many different, no matter what body of water you go to, you always can find something so unique and special about it. So I think that's really neat. And also I love, of course, seeing you at sea, because that's always the fun part of things, right? But my next question for you is, what inspired you to do this work?
Yeah, such a good question too. So I don't know if this is common among all generations or whatever, but I feel like I'm of one of the generations of like everyone in the whole country wanted to be a marine biologist as a kid. And I actually grew up in Michigan with not a particularly water loving family. They're like okay with water, but not like anything crazy. And we would go to the beach to North Carolina or the Carolinas or whatever, once a year, once every few years or whatever. But basically from the time that I was in elementary school, I was dead set on studying the ocean because I loved it so much. And I just kept on going. Everybody thought it was so crazy from where I was growing up. They had no idea. They didn't know, how you would do that. And I just loved it so much that I just, kept learning more and more from where I was. I actually went to undergrad in Michigan because I got some advice that, you can study the ocean eventually. You don't have to, start there. So I actually got a bachelor's in biology in Michigan. But then as soon as I graduated from college, I went to the coast and to the south, and I've really never left the south of winter and on the coast. I've lived on 3 different coasts of the US, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Gulf. But for over 20 years now, I've been studying the ocean, living on basically at the beach for basically my whole adult life, just because I loved it so much.
Yeah, I love that. And also I do have to ask, we have a couple questions coming in from YouTube, and one of them is, what are you kissing? Is that an octopus?
Yeah. Yeah, so that was an octopus on one of those research trips where we were sampling. You know, when you put a trap in the water and it has dead fish in it, a lot of different things might come up. And, you know, a lot of things come up and try to eat that bait. So we were, you know, we were sampling. It was a long, hot day of sampling. And I don't know, if somebody bet me I wouldn't kiss it or something, but.
That's fantastic. That's great. And of course, then the photo is inspiring generations to come, right?
Right.
But I also want to add, I think that's really important that you mentioned your background coming from Michigan and going to school. And I was a first generation college student, so I didn't really know the college system all super well. And so I also did a degree in biology just because I went to a really small school in northern New Jersey that didn't have a marine biology program. But I think that's really important to recognize, is that I think there's so many different pathways to get to the ocean. And even if you're currently in college or you're not thinking about going to a school that particularly has a marine biology major, just as long as you get the skills to become a good scientist, I think it really can lead you anywhere. So I love that you mentioned that it didn't originally start that way. But I also what also drove you to make a difference in terms, or to go into marine biology? Was it to make a difference? Was it to do, research?
Yeah. So I started, I started my career actually in outdoor education. I worked at a place called Catalina Island Marine Institute for 2 years. And I also worked on what we call tall ships, which are basically like replicas of sailing ships from the 1800s. And that was super fun. But what I realized relatively quickly was that outdoor ed actually is fantastic for, introducing kids and students to the world of the ocean and the just opening their eyes to what's out there. But the thing that really actually made me fall in love with fisheries was the direct application. And what I mean by that is that as we've been talking through this, the information that I provide is directly to people who are going to make the decisions about how many fish we can catch and maintaining sustainable populations next year and the next year and the next year. And this is very immediate. A lot of what I've done and a lot of basic research is not as applied, which is fantastic. And we need that basic research. We absolutely do. But to me, it's such a great payback to know that the information that I'm providing is going to make decisions tomorrow or the next day. And that really inspires me to just keep going and keep doing it.
Often people take it off of a journal or, out of the lab and really get it to connect to, the people that can use it the most to help, provide and make sure that these fisheries and other resources are around for years to come. So I definitely appreciate the work that you're doing. But my next question for you is kind of going off of that is, so now that you've been in this field for a while, what innovation are you most excited about in your field?
Yeah, so there are a lot of them, and there are a lot of really cool innovations and new techniques that are coming down, and especially fisheries is kind of an old field, and because it's been sort of because it is so applied and we want that information tomorrow, we want to keep doing things the same way we have for decades, but that doesn't always work. It doesn't advance the field. You might be able to find out new information by trying a new technique. And that's actually what I did using it during my PhD. So during my PhD, I used an almost completely new technique where we took the chemistry of the eye lenses from fish and recreated where those fish were and what they were eating throughout their entire lifetime. And this is completely new. This is a technique that's borrowed from geology. And it's also, up until 5 or 8 years ago, maybe, we didn't even know that this was a thing that was possible. So it's a field that's really exploding, and I think really has a lot of potential. So an eye lens is basically in a fish. As the fish is growing, it's continuing to add material to the outside of the lens. And so that material that is basically the chemicals that fish is eating, that's coming from its food. And so you can actually see in that right-hand picture that the inner parts were created when that fish was very tiny. And then it grows in rings throughout its entire lifetime. And so you can actually peel those all the way back apart and see what was happening to that fish, what it was eating, basically where it was living throughout its entire life. So this is a totally new, like I said, this is a completely new innovation, something that's really just right at the edge of what we can accomplish. And there's so much potential for this technique going forward. It's very exciting.
That's amazing. And that's such a cool technique. And I actually just recently learned about that technique. And I thought it was amazing because I think we so often remember or we think about trees and the rings that they grow and how that works. So it's so cool that we can look at something that is not like a tree that is rooted, but we can look at a fish that's moving and migrating and changing throughout its life so much, and then actually go back and figure out what it was doing all those years. So I think this kind of research is really going to, change this field completely.
Yeah. Yeah, and so this next image is just sort of showing sort of how it gets from the eye to the information. So as you can imagine, these eyes are actually relatively small. And when you're taking them apart into 20 or 30 layers, that's an even smaller amount. So in the left-hand picture, those are individual samples, which are measured in micrograms. And then we feed them into this amazing machine called an isotope ratio mass spectrometer, which actually counts the atoms, counts the carbon atoms and the nitrogen atoms and how many are heavy and how many are light. And then through lots of coding, we can translate that into locations and movements of these fish.
Very cool. And I know you mentioned this a little bit already, but I want to just really emphasize how applicable your research is. And so can you tell us a little bit more about how your work contributes to a sustainable future?
Yeah. So fisheries in general, the field of fisheries and marine fisheries biology really is just right there, right at the edge of continuing to maintain those sustainable populations. 40 or 50 years ago, there was really a belief that the oceans are limitless. We couldn't possibly catch all of the fish that are out there. And now, of course, we know that that isn't true. That really, between technology and numbers of people who are interested in catching fish, we really do need to put limits on what fish we can catch, how many, what sizes, that sort of thing, in order to maintain those populations for future generations. And of course, again, as I touched on at the very beginning, we can't put our hands on every single fish that's out in the ocean. We can't even put our hands on every single fish that is being caught. So we have to, again, use statistical models. We're only able to put our hands on a very tiny fraction of the fish that are out there. And so the more data that we can collect from the people that are fishing and from the fish themselves, the better our models can be and the more accurate they can be. We see the same kind of thing with hurricane modeling. If you think back, if you look back to the tracks that were produced in hurricane modeling 3 decades ago in the 90s, it was not that precise. We didn't really know where a hurricane was going to go. And now you look at hurricane models and predictions, and they are almost spot on to where those hurricanes end up. And that's just because we're able to collect more data, more information, more able to tune those models and have them reflect reality in a much better way. It's the same thing in any kind of modeling situation, especially fisheries. And this is such an applied area where we just, we need this information in order to have fish out there in the future.
For sure. I think I loved your analogy to hurricane models too, because I think we forget how even in just 50, 60 years, how much these different fields have evolved and how we're getting so much better technology and techniques like you've brought up throughout our talk or throughout our conversation that have really just improved these models so that we can really make sure that a lot of these fisheries are sustainable for many generations to come. So I love that your work is so applied because I think it's super important. But I do want to pause and ask a couple of really fun questions for you. And then we're going to talk and kind of shift gears a little bit to what are some of the more practical ways of getting to where you got to in terms of your career. But the first question is, what is your favorite marine animal?
Oh, that's a really good question. Wow. I think for today, I'm gonna have to go with the live grouper. They are just the coolest. Well, no, I'm gonna broaden that. Lots of different kinds of groupers. My other favorite is gonna be red grouper. Red grouper are super cute. They make these little holes in the ground and they're their homes, and then they like garden in them. It's really amazing. They also switch sexes, which is really incredible. We don't even have time to get into any of that craziness. But yeah, I would say red grouper and Goliath grouper.
Very cool. I don't think I've ever heard somebody say that grouper is their favorite animal, so that makes me really happy.
Yeah, red grouper are the cutest. They really are what made me want to get a PhD. That's amazing. I just want to know what they're doing at those holes.
I feel like that should be your slogan.
Yeah, and I still haven't really figured it out, but I've done a little bit more. So
that's so cool. And then my next question for you is, what is your dream location to sample?
Oh man, that's such a good question too. Besides the Tortugas, I think I would really love to go to the Flower Gardens Park. And I've heard amazing things about that area, and just be able to see, what's available, what kinds of fish are there, what kind of species live there, and yeah, I think the Flower Gardens would be amazing.
Yeah, I've heard lots of amazing things about Flower Gardens, so that's another place I really want to dive at some point. So yeah. Very cool. Okay, so now shifting gears a little bit, I just want to talk a little bit about how you got here in terms of your career, and what are maybe some of the hardships that you've had to overcome, and how did you do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's like I've said before, I've done a lot of different jobs, and there's always going to be challenges throughout your life and throughout your career. I think, and one thing that you always need to do is to ask for help, get people involved. No matter, scientists have this bad habit of kind of feeling like they're the only ones, that they should be like a solo artist, whatever, but it's not true. Science is really very collaborative, and science is also part of society, and we need to lean on the people that are around us and ask them for help. I obviously have a kid. I had my kid while I was getting my PhD. So, that took a lot of coordination and a lot of help from a lot of different people.
Absolutely. And did you have any really good mentors that helped you through your PhD or your process, or even starting undergrad that helped you get to where you are?
Yeah, I mean, obviously mentors are, instrumental at every single level. It doesn't matter who you are, there's always going to be somebody that you can learn from and that can really help you out. I can definitely I've had mentors at every single level. I had a fabulous undergraduate advisor who, let me work in bird biology, ornithology. I knew nothing about birds whatsoever. And, I did projects on birds through undergrad. And, during my master's degree, I had amazing mentors who really showed me what fisheries was. Like, I didn't know anything about fisheries. I thought maybe I should, I was kind of interested in like benthic ecology and like learning about the different communities that were on the bottom and stuff like that, which is cool. But when I learned, when my mentors taught me about fisheries and just how applied it was, that was it. That was the thing, and I've had fantastic mentors throughout both my work and school time. As a person who has bounced back and forth sort of between school and work for over 20 years. I was 4 years after my bachelor's that I started my master's degree. It was 9 years after my master's that I started my PhD. So, I've had fantastic mentors throughout that entire process. Faculty at USF College of Marine Science were amazing, really taught me a ton of just how to be a scientist in the world, and especially a woman scientist in the world. There's still a lot of ways in which it's harder for us, and ways that we need to navigate. So yeah, it's always asking for help and engaging your community, no matter where you are, is really the most important thing that I can say.
Yes, I love that answer, of course. And it's really funny because we have so many similarities, because when I actually got my start also in ornithology, doing bird banding and doing data like that and going through that kind of experience. And then I also did something very different at undergrad. I looked at small mammal populations and realized that was not quite the right fit. But I think it is really very much a moment when you figure out exactly what you really love to do, and then it's like, yep, that's it, that's what I'm going to do from here on out. So I think that I love that you mentioned just so many different experiences that help to build you as a scientist, and I think that's really important. And of course, I love that you touched on being a woman in STEM, because I think so often we think that I'm so grateful for the women who have gone before me, who have like helped break that glass ceiling, but I still think that doesn't mean that we don't face challenges still today. I think a lot of times kind of the analogy is we're still kind of cleaning up a lot of that broken glass and figuring out how to navigate that path. So I definitely, appreciate that you mentioned that there is still so much work to be done there. So hopefully generations after us also, find it a little bit easier, and it's a more diverse field. So my next question for you is, what advice would you give to students who would be interested in pursuing a career in this field?
Yeah, I think there's a few, I could probably talk all day about advice and different things. But, if you have a passion, just go for it. Like I said from the beginning, when I was a kid in Michigan and even, into college and stuff, people were like, what are you talking about? What are you doing? I went to a college that was known for their pre-med program. I was like one of two people, in the entire biology department who was not pre-med. And, everybody was just mystified. Like, what are you going to do? I'm like, we'll figure it out, and just keep taking one step at a time and you'll figure it out.
And then also, I know you mentioned you had a couple of different career shifts as well.
Yeah. I think, the other thing is, don't be afraid to try everything. Like I did. I have done a lot of different jobs. I have basically, I distill it down to having been a marine biologist for the last 20 plus years. But throughout that time, I've had tons of different jobs. I've done outdoor education, where basically my main job was to take kids snorkeling in the Pacific Ocean, which was pretty amazing. I've been a sailor, where we would live on a ship and bring kids on to teach them about the history. I've even been a a traditional high school classroom teacher. I spent 3 years teaching high school and teaching biology and chemistry to kids that thought that maybe they weren't that into science, you know. And I spent a good deal of time working in the field of fisheries biology, both from the standpoint of collecting the fish and collecting the information about the people that are going fishing and what they're catching. All of it is just so interesting, and it all builds together, you know. I mean, like I mentioned previously, it was over 15 years from the time that I finished undergrad until I started my PhD. And I honestly feel like I had a much easier PhD than many of my cohort because I had all of that experience and all of that background. I didn't come straight from college. I had a lot of experience working. I had a lot of experience in fisheries. I knew I had a lot of connections because I've lived in this town for close to 15 years. I had been in this town and known the people for almost 10. And when I decided that I needed to get a bunch of red grouper to do my work, I knew exactly who to call, and I knew how to get them, and I knew what paperwork I needed. All of those things are things that people, you know, if they're going straight into a graduate program, they have to learn as they go. And as a person who had been working in this field for a while, I had all that background already, which made each step just that much easier. And so that's also a huge piece of advice that I like to give people all the time, is that it's never too late. If you think that you still want to do something, just do it. And you will, by engaging your community and asking for help and taking it one step at a time, you will be able to finish it. You know, like I said, it was 9 years after my master's degree that I decided to enroll in a PhD program. I started my PhD at 38. I got pregnant. I had a kid. And I finished my PhD at 42. So, you know, I completed this journey as far as, you know, marine science education. I can't get much more. But you know, but it isn't too late. You know, I got the advice all the way from undergrad, like, oh, if you don't just keep going and keep getting education, and if you go out into the working world, you're never going to come back. And that's just completely untrue. I've done it 2 different times, and it's totally doable. It's a thing that anybody can do. And I would absolutely recommend that anybody do it that way.
Yes, and I can definitely attest to the challenges that you're talking about, because I did go right out of undergrad into grad school. And so I started grad school at 22, and there was just so much that I had. It was just such a steep learning curve, because you not only are just so used to being a student for so much of your life, and grad school is kind of this unique mix between being a student, but also being an employee too. And so you're trying to kind of balance this world of trying to become an adult and figuring out all of these things, like moving to a new state for me, and figuring out apartments and all of these things that I didn't really have to go through as much in undergrad. And then of course going and then trying to complete a very challenging, you know, doctoral program as well. So I appreciate your perspective, and I wish I would have had more of that before I launched writing, because there is definitely a lot of fear that they give you when you're graduating, that, oh, if you don't do it now, you'll never do it. But I think that's, you know, there are so many amazing testaments that that's not true, like yourself. So I definitely appreciate your story, and your, you know, showing everybody that it doesn't matter the age. It's really just becoming an expert in your field, and everybody can take their own path to get there. So now we have so many great questions that I want to get to before we end things, unfortunately, because I'm really enjoying this conversation. But one of the questions from Zoom is from Pantera, and she wants to know, was it hard to get your first job?
My first job was in a very different time than it is now.
Okay.
I mean, you know, it was 1999. The structure and everything was very, very different. Although I decided that was really what I wanted to do with outdoor education, and I really, really wanted to work at this place. And I literally called those people every single day for like a week until they were like, okay, fine, you can have our job. So, I mean, I think, yes, even though it was a very different landscape, it was tough, but it also, I think it's important to make connections and make sure that if it's something that you really want, just stay on top of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things is that so many people have told me in my career is that it never hurts to ask. So even if you're afraid to reach out to somebody, maybe it's a top job that's your dream job, like it doesn't hurt to like get your name on their radar and to reach out. And maybe you won't get the ideal job that you want when you first apply, but over time you may be able to work your way to that and make connections that can help you get there. So definitely, I love your message of persistence. I think that's really important. So the next two questions is actually from two people. One is from Jacqueline and the other is from Cindy, but I'm going to put them together just for time's sake. But one of them is, what has been your favorite scuba dive? And do you have to get scuba certified to work in marine science?
So first of all, no, you do not have to get scuba certified to work in marine science. I know lots of marine scientists who are not scuba certified at all. There are lots of different types of work. Like, I have never done a science job where I got paid to go scuba diving. I wish I did, but and I am a scuba diver in my free time, and I'm also a dive instructor. But you don't have to be a scuba diver to be a marine scientist at all. In fact, especially with a lot of the technology that we have today, with video cameras and everything like that, yeah, you never have to get underwater, and you still can see everything that's under there. Shoot, what was the other one?
What has been your favorite scuba dive?
It's my favorite scuba dive. Yeah. Oh man. So I did get to do a bunch of coral transects in the dry Tortugas. That was a volunteer activity. So that was pretty amazing. Quantifying the corals and also the cryptic fish, so like the teeny tiny like gobies and stuff that live in the corals in the dry Tortugas was probably one of the best scuba diving experiences I've had. Although I've done a lot of really cool ones. Yeah, right there. Diving the kelp forests in Southern California is also a huge highlight. If you ever, if you can stand the cold water out there, it's amazing to be diving in these basically like high-rise apartments. It's incredible.
I always like to see all the different photos that come of it, because it's totally, once you get beneath the waves, it's a totally different place. And so that's definitely on my bucket list. Yeah, there's a great photo of that. It's literally like you're diving through a forest. That is how cool it is.
Yeah. And in Southern California, there's sea lions and seals that are, out there all the time. And if you go a little bit further north, there's often otters and just charismatic megafauna everywhere.
I love it. And then our last question for the night is, can you talk a little bit more about your experience working with fishers?
Yeah, let me see. So I actually haven't done a lot of work myself working closely and interviewing fishers. What I have done is to have fishers help me to collect my samples. So like I said, I needed a lot of like to get the eye lenses out of these fish, I needed a lot of fish. I needed to collect like a couple hundred fish from multiple different species. And some of them were fish that are commonly encountered in surveys. And so I could just ask the people who are already going to be out there, doing their research surveys. Okay, if you see a red grouper in a trap, keep it for me. But I also knew that there was quite a few that species and sizes that are just almost never seen in surveys. And so I actually had to go out and talk to fishers and have them take me fishing so that we could get the fish that I needed. And they're often not the fish that they would want. They would most of the time be fish that they would be throwing back. but I got special permission to keep them. And so then they would be able to take me on their boat, and we would be able to keep these fish that you normally can't keep, but I needed them for research purposes. So and in that circumstance, in that instance, and also, I guess I've also done some monitoring work from commercial fishing boats, where the people who are, catching fish for the restaurants and stuff like that, we would essentially buy their time and go, use the gear that we needed to get the fish that we needed on their boats. And working with fishers like that is really a phenomenal experience, and a phenomenal, it's just a really good way to connect, because in so many places, of course, like in any sort of, wildlife situation, the people who are utilizing the resource are often at odds with the people who are trying to conserve the resource. And so it can be a contentious situation sometimes. But in those instances, it was always so nice to just be able to spend hours with these people and really talk to them about what we were trying to understand and what we were trying to know and what we were learning. Because in general, they're really interested in those kinds of things, in learning what we're learning, and seeing what we're seeing, and seeing how what they're doing is contributing to the bigger picture. And so those are really great memories from working with fishers. And also the thing is, a lot of times in an academic setting, sometimes we tend to think of because we're so educated, we're sort of better or something. But if you spend enough time with people who have spent their entire life on the water, you come to learn very quickly that they know a lot of things that we have no idea about at all. And it has nothing to do with their education. It just has to do with their exposure to the environment and to, just being out there. And it's a very humbling experience too. So just remember how little we know as scientists, and how much people sort of just know just from experience.
Absolutely. And I love that everything you just said, I absolutely loved, because I worked out in Newport, Oregon for an internship in college, and I was studying a really weird type of jellyfish called pyrosomes. And they were super patchy. So some days you'd go out and you see hundreds of them, and the next day you go out and you wouldn't see any of them in that same exact location. So I really relied on the fishing community there to help me find them. And they would take us out to do sampling with our equipment, or they would, I could call them up and they'd bring back samples for me to do stuff in the lab. So I really grew a bond with the fishing community there and just appreciated their insight. And so often they have such amazing generational knowledge from their parents and their grandparents who have been doing this career their entire lives. And it's so incredible to it's a humbling experience, because they know so much about the day-to-day conditions that I think as scientists, again, you mentioned, there's sometimes this weird, I don't know, interchange between scientists and fishers, just because there is that kind of at odds perspective. But I've only found amazing experiences with them. And a lot of times they'll still message me and send me pictures of different things that identify. And it's really a fun collaboration when people can, kind of realize we have so much to learn from each other. So I love that you mentioned that. But on that note, I want to thank you so much, Julie. You can all stay in touch with Julie and keep up with her tremendous work. Here are all of her links to social channels, website, and even her direct email. So thank you so much again for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. This has been a super fun conversation. I've really enjoyed getting to talk to you about kind of my background and how I got to where I am.
Absolutely. This has been a blast. I don't even want the conversation to end. I'm having so much fun. But with that, I also want to remind everyone to be sure to stay connected with EarthEcho on our social media channels. Visit earthecho.org to find out more information about all of our exciting programs, including upcoming virtual events, just like this one. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit that subscribe button before you go. So on behalf of EarthEcho International, thank you for joining us, and keep exploring.